What would you do if you looked across the battlefield and realized that thousands of enemy soldiers were coming toward you? You have almost no chance of reinforcement. Your ammunition is limited. Your position is surrounded. And behind you, there is nowhere left to run. For most soldiers, the order would be simple. Fall back. But history contains moments when small groups of soldiers refused to do exactly that. They stayed. They fought. And they bought time for everyone behind them. This is the story of one of those forgotten battles, a battle where a tiny force found itself facing an enemy many times larger. And what happened next became a story of courage, desperation, and survival. The battlefield was already changing. Across Europe, armies were moving rapidly. Large formations were advancing, cities were falling, and defensive positions that had once seemed secure were becoming dangerously exposed. For the soldiers defending this position, the situation looked increasingly hopeless. They were heavily outnumbered. The enemy had more men, more equipment, more ammunition, and more options. The defenders had only one major advantage. They knew the ground. Their position gave them a chance to slow the advancing force. And that was exactly what they intended to do. The mission was not to defeat an entire army. It was to delay it. That distinction was critical. Sometimes in war, victory doesn't mean destroying the enemy. Sometimes victory means surviving long enough to accomplish one specific objective. Every minute matters. Every road matters. Every bridge matters. And every delay gives friendly forces more time to reorganize. The defenders understood this. So they prepared their position. Weapons were placed where they could cover the most important approaches. Ammunition was distributed carefully. Soldiers checked their equipment. There was no illusion about what was coming. The enemy was too large. The defenders knew they couldn't fight forever. But they didn't need to. They only needed to hold. Then the first enemy elements appeared. At first, the battlefield seemed strangely quiet. Then the distant movement became clearer. More soldiers. Then more. And behind them, even more. The defenders watched as the force continued to grow. What had initially looked like a small advance was actually the beginning of something much larger. Thousands of enemy troops were moving toward the area. For a moment, the reality of the situation must have been impossible to ignore. A tiny defensive force was about to confront an army. The first attack came. The defenders opened fire. The advancing troops were forced to slow down. The terrain became a battlefield. Smoke filled the air. Orders were shouted. Men moved from one defensive position to another. The defenders had one advantage the attackers couldn't easily eliminate. Every position had been chosen carefully. Instead of meeting the larger force in an open field, the smaller force used cover, terrain, and defensive positions to make every advance difficult. The enemy moved forward. The defenders resisted. Again. And again. Every time the attackers pushed closer, the defenders answered. But there was a problem. Ammunition was disappearing. And ammunition is time. Every round fired is one less round available for the next attack. The defenders couldn't afford waste. They had to make every shot count. As the battle continued, the pressure increased. The enemy began probing the defensive positions from different directions. The defenders were no longer dealing with one attack. They were dealing with pressure from multiple directions. The battlefield was becoming a trap. Yet the small force continued to hold. Why? Because they understood something the enemy couldn't afford to forget. Every minute they survived was a minute gained. Somewhere behind them, other forces were moving. People were evacuating. Defensive positions were being strengthened. Supplies were being relocated. Orders were being passed. The small group was buying time. And time was their real weapon. Then the enemy attack intensified. The defenders were exhausted. Some positions had been damaged. Communication was becoming difficult. Smoke and dust made it harder to see. The men knew that the situation was getting worse. But there was still no order to abandon the position. So they stayed. This is the part of military history that is often difficult to understand from a distance. Years later, people look at maps. They study troop numbers. They examine weapons and tactics. But none of those maps show what it feels like to hear thousands of enemy soldiers approaching while knowing that only a small group stands between them and their objective. The men defending the position weren't superheroes. They were ordinary soldiers. They were tired. They were afraid. They knew they could die. And yet they continued. That is what makes stories like this so powerful. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's continuing to act despite it. As the fighting continued, the defenders began reaching the limits of what their position could withstand. The enemy had numbers. They could replace losses. They could attack again. The defenders couldn't. Every wounded soldier mattered. Every lost weapon mattered. Every remaining round mattered. Eventually, the question was no longer whether the position could survive forever. It couldn't. The question was, had the defenders delayed the enemy long enough? And in battles like this, that can be the difference between failure and success. The small force had done what it was asked to do. It had slowed an enemy that should have been able to overwhelm it much faster. It had forced the larger force to spend time and resources. And it had given other units the opportunity to prepare. That is the hidden side of military history. The soldiers who hold the line aren't always the ones who receive the most attention. Sometimes their greatest achievement is simply giving someone else enough time to survive. Eventually, the defensive position could no longer be maintained. The surviving soldiers were forced to withdraw, surrender, or fight their way out, depending on the circumstances of the battle. But the larger force had paid a price in time. The small group had accomplished something far greater than its numbers suggested. It had demonstrated that numerical superiority doesn't always translate into an immediate victory. Terrain matters. Preparation matters. Leadership matters. Discipline matters. And sometimes, morale matters most of all. The story of this forgotten battle isn't really about 100 men. It's about what happens when ordinary soldiers are placed in an extraordinary situation. A force that should have been overwhelmed immediately managed to resist an enemy many times its size. They didn't change the entire war. They didn't destroy thousands of enemy soldiers. They didn't magically turn defeat into victory. But they did something that is often just as important in war. They bought time. And time can save lives. That's why military history is filled with stories of small units making seemingly impossible stands. A handful of soldiers at the right position can delay an entire advance. A single defensive line can give an army enough time to reorganize. And a few hours can sometimes change the outcome of an entire operation. The numbers on the map may say one thing. But the battlefield can tell a completely different story. The forgotten defenders of this battle were never supposed to defeat thousands. They were simply supposed to hold. And for as long as they could. They did. Their story reminds us that military victories aren't always measured by territory captured or enemies destroyed. Sometimes, victory is measured in minutes. Sometimes, it's measured in lives saved. And sometimes, it's measured by one simple fact. When everyone expected them to run, they stayed. That is why the story of the forgotten battle where a tiny force faced an army remains worth remembering. Because wars are not only decided by the largest armies. They are also shaped by the small groups who stand in the way. The soldiers who hold the line. The men who buy time. And the few who refuse to surrender when surrender seems like the only logical choice. History may remember the armies that won. But sometimes, the most unforgettable stories belong to the men who simply refuse to move.